celebrity allure of entrepreneurship, many exceptional entrepreneurs remain shadowed. Here, I team up with these hidden talents to unveil their challenges and successes. Dive in with me to unearth entrepreneurial gems, learn from our experiences, and get educated. Welcome to the podcast. Glad you could be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
How's sunny Florida doing?
Yeah, as you can see, it's sunny, holding up to its name.
It's good to see you. Welcome here. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. What's going on in your life? What's new?
Keeping out of trouble as much as possible. But yeah, I'm going to say it's fun for extended travel to be back in home base and picking up with some projects and new initiatives. So
you're working on a few projects right now, aren't you? Like what do you got in the hopper right now?
I'm working on a couple of initiatives, which I just think will be a new direction for the next 10 years. Core of one is just looking at the breakdown in kind of civil discourse, both in the public sphere and online, and how that's potentially been exacerbated by some of our wonderful tech platforms, and how you, as a technologist, how you can maybe counter that and redress some of that, undo some of the harm that has been done by some of our traditional and social media platforms, and how we can perhaps bring some civil discourse back to discussing issues that matter to humanity instead of what we seem to be spiraling down to in the moment. So tough problem. If there was easy answers, then they would have been.
Everybody would be doing it, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. So.
What are you mainly concerned with when you say physical or discourse? What was the word that you used to describe that?
Civil discourse.
Civil discourse. So how do you describe civil discourse, and what is it that's angsting you in that area?
I think it's the I think the counter example for civil discourse is a lot of what we see in today's traditional media and the breakdown that we see in our online platforms to a large degree. I think it's not necessarily that we're any less polarized. I think in the US in particular, we've always had, there's always been this kind of differences between a liberal and a conservative, but I think people have just seemed to have sorted themselves, and now it's become their identity, and suddenly, everyone seems to be shouting at each other instead of listening. So I think it's how do you get back to some degree of non-partisan, non-biased, either news, coverage of critical affairs, or if you bring it into our social platforms, how can you have a conversation even about, topics that people are going to disagree on without it suddenly becoming, the lowest common denominator of people, calling each other different names or trying to cancel people or create movements to ban things and ban books. And, it feels, over the last, I would say, 10 years with the rise of, and I don't think it's necessarily the cause, but certainly exacerbated by the rise of the iPhone and, these gadgets and devices in our pocket, and then the incentives that certainly social media platforms have that are really, they live in the attention economy. The more attention they have, the more ads they can drive. So, their incentives are, I personally feel misaligned with the business that they are in, which is really connecting billions of people in the moment and the spread and sharing of information to the masses. So you've got a business model that really rewards the sensational. It rewards the stoking of rage, because that's what gets people to, the easy way to get people to pay attention, and the easy way to have people share things, whether what you're saying is true or not doesn't really matter if it rewards the attention machine, and I get you to spend more minutes on my site versus someone else's, and I get to show you more ads. So I think it's kind of this, social experiment we've been running, I think, over the last decade plus, that I think is overwhelmingly impacting the youth as they grow up with these devices in their pockets. It's affecting their psychology, their mental health, their self-esteem. And, they're growing up in an environment that just feels like, any conversation in the public sphere, is all about stoking rage and partisanship. So, I look at it and I say, okay, our tech platforms are certainly, and the business models and the business incentives are certainly a good degree to blame here. So, how can you use technology to play and perhaps call out our better angels to come and play rather than the little devils on our shoulders when we're engaging in public discourse?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously a hot topic, and it's I think it's a massive problem. I would say personally for myself, I've, I can look back at my past, and I've been, pretty fortunate. I've got two kids. They're got their heads on pretty straight. 21 to 18 years old, just turned 18 a couple days ago. And so there's a whole bunch of things that pile into this cesspool of problem that's existing in the world today. And so how do you I look at it over the last 30 years. I've been a pretty positive guy. I mean, about humanity, about society, about, I've always had this belief that, my parents used to say, oh, kids these days. And, their parents before them said, oh, damn kids these days, So is this a generational fad that is happening, in the world? And I'm asking that question to get a better understanding from where you're coming from. But, I often am asking myself that question: is this just something that's generational right now? And if I just turned into my parents, the old guy that's saying now, well, teenagers nowadays, just can't get, they don't understand. And of course, their rebuttal is, well, we don't understand. And so, I question whether or not, is this a generational thing that's happening right now with the advancement of technology and social media, and we just haven't figured it out, and maybe it will figure itself out, down the road? Or do we really have a problem on our hands that is, systemic in our society? And so, and then, how do you fix this? So I don't know how that, what your thoughts are on.
I mean, I've had exactly the same, as I've been brainstorming this idea with some folks, and it's just, am I turning into when TV or radio or TV or whatever, they the media of each coming generation, and how the parents were, I think for my generation it was gaming, the gaming consoles, and everyone was spending too much time indoors playing games instead of being outdoors, and how it's going to lead to, the violence of games and so on and so forth. And, I guess it didn't necessarily pan out that way. I guess, it's still somewhat of a debate. But I think in this, this is not just I call out the impact on the youth in terms of tangible, measurable, science-based research that has been done in terms of impact on mental health, rise in suicides or suicidal thoughts, so on and so forth. But the wider problem is nothing to do with the youth necessarily. It's our politicians. It's our traditional media platforms, whether that be CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the talking heads just, stoking rage against the other. The fact that we become, measurably, from scientific research wise, certainly in the United States, and I think this probably holds for a lot of, Western democracies, has become more polarized. We now look at, not just I might have more conservative views or more liberal views, but now it's you're a Democrat or you're a Republican in the US. And with that comes a label and identity. And now we can't even see beyond that. And suddenly every issue that we deal with becomes polarized in our media landscape, and COVID was just the the most recent example of, whether you wear a mask or not didn't come down to whether it was good scientifically, which it may or may not have been. Best research at the time, at least for a period, said it probably would help. But it was, well, if I'm a Republican, no, I'm not going to wear a mask. It's against my free, my liberty or whatever it is. If I'm a Democrat, then, oh, well, of course I'm going to wear a mask. It's for the public good. So, that is the landscape that we can't even have that type of discussion without it descending and, into a debate about rage. And, in some ways I kind of look, and I'm more, I remain an optimist. I'm a pragmatic optimist perhaps, but as a technologist and entrepreneur, I don't think you have to be an optimist or you're not going to go take the chances with, very little chance, very little hope of success, and yet you still take the chance. So I think I'm wired, and I think, humanity as a whole, where we sit today, the abundance, the health, the people who've been lifted out of poverty over the last couple of decades. I think, humanity at its macro level, when you really zoom out, is the best it's ever been. So that's not my take on this, that I think, this is all going to end in some global war,
brimstone and fire.
Yeah, the four horsemen are coming type of thing, buckle up. But at the same time, I don't think that excuses me or anyone from perhaps taking action and saying, okay, just because I'm optimistic about the future doesn't mean I'm going to sit here and not do anything to help, that more optimistic future come about. And so I look at, this wider landscape of just this polarization, this, the breakdown in civil discourse. And in some ways, is it different? Well, then, my parents telling me I shouldn't be playing so many games. Well, I think so, because it's all generations have been sucked into this. It's not just about the kids being on social media or TikTok. It's about politicians who are septuagenarians posting tweets and, and things to stoke up their base type of thing. So we've all been sucked into this kind of attention-driven economy in many ways. And then I also think that, we've been running a social experiment. One of my good friends, he had a great quote, which was, whoever thought connecting billions of people instantaneously and continuously would lead to good things. And yet that's the experiment we've been running, certainly for the last, decade. I guess Facebook came out in 2000 publicly, 4 or 5 time frame. But I think it's really since you've seen those platforms with the mobile devices in our pockets that you've really seen this social experiment. And we don't know where this may lead up or where this may end up. And so I come back to kind of, something that really resonated for me that I came across, which is just because this may not be done in my lifetime doesn't mean I'm abrogated from the responsibility of starting, to paraphrase a quote. And so this is me kind of saying, hey, this is a big, hairy problem. I don't think I know the answer, but maybe I can be part of, I can be the shoulders for someone else greater than me to stand on and find a way to bring our public discourse back into something that actually is for the good of humanity and isn't, driven by a rage producing machine that is, our media landscape today.
So when you look at this social experiment, as you put it, and there's lots of positives that have come from it. There's lots of, certainly some negatives that have come from it. And I love the quote, like, who thought connecting 1 billion people would be a good idea? I mean, that's an amazing way to look at it. And obviously there's going to be some problems, but as a technologist, how do you start to kind of sift through where the source of the major problems are, or the instigation of these problems that start to fester? And how do you correct it? Well, how do you look at it from that angle and start to say, how do I unwind or begin to unwind this?
Yeah, and I guess, as a tech entrepreneur, I suppose, and with an entrepreneurial lens, I'm going to look at it in terms of what kind of products or services could I develop or, be involved in that might ameliorate this problem or counteract this problem. So that's my natural lens, and that's certainly where I started looking at this. But I also realized that, it was a problem space that defies easy solutions and probably defies a singular solution. I don't think there's, we just need a better Facebook or a better Twitter, bless Elon Musk for what he's trying to do. But, I don't know as if that's the answer, because this is not just about one platform. This is about just the way we've, wired our brains, or, our media system is wired. So what I started on, this problem came into clarity for me probably over a year ago now. I was at an event, and I was just chewing on some interesting, looking at what was happening at that time as we exited COVID, and just thinking, why can we not just be sensible about this? And that coupled with the quote that someone presented while I was at this event, and which I kind of paraphrased, which was, "You are not expected to finish the work, nor are you excused from it." And that was the catalyst for me to kind of say, okay, this is something that I should apply my energy to see if I can find or come up with different ways to tackle the problem. But knowing I'm just one person, I really spent the whole of last year, pretty much every week, once I got it going, I had a small, what I call the kitchen cabinet. And it's just find some like-minded people who are willing to give you an hour or two of their time a week to jump on a call, in this case, obviously it was virtual, and kick the tires on a problem. And this is how, when I've started my first startup, coming out of the corporate world and ended up, getting pulled into the Silicon Valley startup ecosystem, it started off with what turned out to be my co-founder of the company we started. He had an idea in this kind of nascent Web 2.0, as it was called, back in 2004-05. And he just said, "Hey, it's just a kitchen cabinet. We come meet on a Saturday around the kitchen table, and we just, kick the tires on this idea." And he pulled in, myself as a a couple of us that were, coders and developers and technologists, some marketing people, some people who knew about this kind of more internet and consumer web. That wasn't any of our backgrounds. And we just kicked the tires on this thing for, I don't know, probably 6 months. And in the process, it kind of whittled down to the people who stuck through the process, and the people who were willing to give up the day jobs there were 3 of us, myself, my partner who kind of started it all, and another co-founder. And we started a company on the back of that. But the process stuck with me. And it was this way of, how do you bring in complementary people who think differently to you, people with different backgrounds, see who's interested, see who's willing to give you a bit of time. If they're not willing to give you a little bit of time out of their busy work week, then they're probably not someone you should be saying, "Hey, do you want to be a co-founder?" It allows you to vet people and find those that are really interested. And, maybe at the back end of it, there's no commitments either way that someone's going to join you, that you're going to even ask them to be part of a company. But it's just, people who want to be together and work, and contribute some time. So I did that. Did that all through last year, and we just looked at this very broadly and said, "Hey, I'm purposely not trying to find a technology solution to this problem. Let's look at it. Let's look at the research. Let's read the papers. Let's find smart people who have looked at the rise in polarization, that have looked at the breakdown in civil discourse, that have done research and published research around it. Let's kick some tires on some ideas." And out of that year, we came up with 8 tangible concepts, 8 of them, that we thought could be part of the solution. And we realized very early on that there is no one answer. It's probably a combination of all of these. And in some ways, you almost want to find people who are doing and working in all of these areas. And, some of them, for example, was regulation. We probably need people who are interested in getting some form of regulation put in place for some of our, these platforms that have just developed mass audiences and now become these kind of platforms of mass dissemination of information. We probably need regulation, because without it, the profit incentive drives people to corporations to do things that maybe aren't in the best interest of humanity. I'm not a regulation guy. That's not my stick. But I know that probably has to be part of the solution. And thankfully, there are people out there that are, from the whistleblowers coming out of Facebook, or people creating, like the documentary, The Social Dilemma, who are trying to create awareness and then come up with tangible ideas on regulation. So it's like, okay, that's awesome. Education, probably not my stick again, but maybe, getting everyone to have some form of media training to understand our biases and how easy they're triggered, and to understand how these news organizations, these platforms are feeding us this to get us to, to get our attention. So that's an awareness stroke education. So again, not my shtick, but we think it needs to, we need to find people who are interested in doing that and that are out there. And then we came up with some, solutions like, maybe we just need better platforms. Maybe we just need really a new platform designed from the ground up to be a digital town square that could work maybe at the local level, for issues at the local, that just I care about within my city, but could also scale to work at national issues, like having a civil discussion where we may agree to disagree around things like Roe versus Wade, for example, and the fact that the Supreme Court repealed, their ruling on that. So, that's more in my background, that could make sense. Or you look at things like, well, some of the problems we have is just we don't know who the hell's talking. I don't know whether they're a Russian agent. That's perhaps the urban myth anyway. But are they some foreign agent trying to stoke something and it's paid advertising, but I don't know who's even paying for it. So there's an element of, well, what if you could provide a way of actually proving I'm a real person? And that on this platform, I only exist once. So you may not know who I am from a privacy standpoint, but at least you know that I am a real person living in America, for example. I'm just paraphrasing that idea. So there's some people tangibly working on that. Maybe we need a better reputation system where people, based on what they say in the public sphere, whether, written or spoken, we can build up, a profile that kind of says, hey, this person seems like a good faith actor. They're not spreading disinformation. They don't seem to be furthering, some other, corporate interest, but they're just trying to be a good faith actor in their discourse. And maybe, we could then reward those people. And again, big hand wavy, how do you do that? But maybe those people then get, certain feature access to platforms, or they get the algorithms that these platforms could use those ratings and rankings to be able to say, hey, I'm all for free speech, but that doesn't mean that everyone gets equal amplification. And at the moment, our media platforms are really wired to say, if you produce rage, I'm going to amplify you. Versus if you're a good faith actor, and again, what does that mean? Maybe different things for different people, but then I'm going to amplify you. So that's where we ended up coming out of last year, was really these 8 areas. Then we thought, well, we really need to identify people who are working in all of them. And then maybe, from my perspective, I look at it and say, which one of these is, do I think I'm uniquely positioned to go innovate on, and maybe build a business or a venture or something that, a nonprofit vehicle that's good for humanity. And that's where we ended. End of last year, went traveling for a little bit, and that's where I'm picking up, really starting middle of last month, and looking at it and saying, okay, I think, there's a problem here, there's a big problem here. I think it has the potential to impact positively the lives of billions of people. So, what one do I want to go tackle? And, so now I'm starting a new cabinet, inviting people in to specifically look at one of the solution areas that we identified. So that's kind of the process that, it's a big, hairy, it's maybe it's a moonshot, if you want to use that kind of language, but I think it ties back to my, what I call my massively transformative purpose that I've been chewing on for maybe nearly a decade, which is just this idea that to solve some of the challenges that civilization, that humanity faces, take your pick, whether it's climate change or, again, the breakdown in social discourse and polarization of society, the move from democracies to autocracy, there's something that hopefully most people will be able to identify as something. I kind of look at it and say, well, if you believe what, good old Mr. Albert Einstein says, you can't solve today's problem with the same kind of thinking that created them, to kind of paraphrase that. So I then said, okay, well, if we're going to solve some of these problems, then we need to shift human consciousness. We need to shift the level of thinking of our society at a big scale. So I then came down to, okay, well, how do you shift the consciousness? How do you elevate the consciousness, change the way of thinking of 1 billion people? How do we change the conversation of 1 billion people? And, that's where I kind of, doing my tech thing, it's like, wow, that's a huge, big problem. I really don't know how to solve that. I'm not going to bother. That's someone else's. It's a great idea. I'll keep thinking about it, but I took no action. And as I said, it was seeing that quote over a year ago that was, really, I think, gave me the mementos. You're not expected to finish the work, nor are you excused from it. I thought, damn. That was a kick up the backside. So, maybe I need to get my entrepreneurial hat on again.
Yeah. So you talked about a few things there, quite a few things, but so one of the things that, maybe it's my assumption, but just to get clarity from you, is there might be a pocket for you guys to kind of develop inside of creating communities. And that was kind of one thing I think I heard, and then there was two other pieces that I thought were really interesting. One was education, because, it dawned on me as you said it. And I mean, I'd never really thought about it before, but when you said education, it's like, yeah, we've launched people into this new, technological era, and not just with technology, but it's also social media and how to behave, in that environment. And then you talked about anonymity. So, that's the other part where it's, you can say whatever you want and nobody knows who you are. So there's no recourse. There's, nobody's holding you to a standard.
Yep.
And I know, I remember simply, growing up as a kid, if I lived in a small community, so it was kind of a little bit more in your face. But if I didn't behave within some guardrails, and my parents found out, through friends of friends or at school or whatever, I mean, there was a kick up the hindside. And so there was some consequence, to how I behaved. That didn't mean I, wasn't an ass at times. Of course I was growing up, but there were some mechanisms in place to draw you back and hold you accountable, and, show some awareness of how to behave in a public place. So, I don't know if you could jump on one or all three of those, what your thoughts are.
No, I think it is very much related, and it's like the lack of consequences. Societies, groups came together, formed tribes created societies. It was, good behavior, shall we say, isn't wired into us necessarily evolutionary, you could argue. But we are wired to be part of a group, to be part of a tribe, just simply survival, from a survival standpoint. And part of that wiring, I think, is there's consequences to action. When there's consequences to action, like you were talking about, we tend to there's always aberrations, but most of us are going to be, tend to, the things that are going to be good for us and good for the group as a whole, we're not going to be disruptive to the group because we would fear being kicked out of it. And so I think, obviously we progressed a long way since then as society, but I think that fundamental idea of consequences of, hey, if I went in physically to the middle of a shopping center, clearly people do this, but if I went in and started espousing maybe it's a certain conspiracy theory I believe about, there would probably be some consequences of that. And those consequences are probably what would stop me from wanting to do that. Doesn't stop everyone. When you go online, I'm connected to people that have no idea who I am. Or I can be anonymous. And obviously a lot of, a whole part of the early internet was, hey, the anonymity is an amazing thing. Yes, it is. And it's a double-edged sword. So it removes, I now get to behave in a way that I never would if I was sat, in the same room as you. And I would say things to you. I don't really know who you are, but maybe we're connected online. And I'd say things in a way that I would never do if we were face to face, or if I was in a public forum, because there'd be consequences, because I'd be ashamed or whatever it is. So all the very nature of online kind of removes all of the normal social norms that would probably reel us back from being completely divisive, or railing at someone, or tell them they're swearing at them or whatever it is. Unfortunately, most of our platforms don't have that. Not only that, they reward the people who shout the loudest and are the most sensational about what they're saying, whether it's true or not, because that gets people's attention. Even if I'm outraged, but if I just watched you and you outraged me, I'm now going to share that with all my friends, say, God, look at this, I can't. And so we have, Facebook circa 2012 or whenever it was, when they started adding ads, and they started to really optimize for that attention. And, not just them, lots of platforms. And suddenly you end up in this world where, there's no consequences for me as an individual to say whatever I want, however I want, whether it's true or not. The less true it is in many ways, and the more sensational it is, the more rewards I'm going to get from the platforms that I'm using. So you've kind of got this double whammy that just, I think, is, part of what's, driven not just social media, but it's even bled into really how our traditional media is now wired, with the talking heads on Fox and MSNBC. And it's allowed, I think, in the political spectrum in the US for sure, you've got 10% on the kind of the right, 10% on the left, shouting at each other and screaming at each other. There's no way they're ever going to see eye to eye. And all we get to hear about, the 80% of us that sit in the middle, all we get to hear about in our media, on our social channels, is what these two groups are shouting at each other. So you're 20% of the population driving, 80% of the discussion and what happens online. And it used to be, Twitter would cover the news. News breaks, people would tweet about it. Now people tweet, and the news is about what people are tweeting. So, it's just become this, again, I just think it's a cycle down unless we can find ways to change our platforms. Regulation. If someone in Congress or in our government would stand up and say, hey, you can't be in the attention business, in the selling digital, hyper-targeted digital ads, if you're going to be a social platform. Find a different business model. Suddenly, you've made you've taken the advertiser out. The incentive is not to find more attention to sell you ads. Instead, it's going to be, hey, I need to get you to subscribe to my platform. Oh boy, I better actually make sure that you like my platform and you want to use my platform. So, I think, it changes the incentives. That, again, there's lots of different areas of regulation, but
can that regulate? Can you do that? How does that happen?
I have no idea.
I'm just trying to
Why
think
not?
of how can you actually get, that kind of regulation in. I mean, especially when you have these opposing views, And then you're asking those people to get together and come up with some type of answer like that. I don't even know if that's ever a
I
possibility in our future.
I think, and well, I think, and again, this might be my somewhat jaded self, but if you look at our political landscape, the politicians have been captured by the attention economy. They're vested in the attention economy because
That's how they
they're
get voted in.
tweeting, posting videos, shouting at the opposition the loudest to stoke the most rage from their base. So they've been captured by the very business model, the very, and again, it's not, I can't blame them necessarily. That's just the way that our media platforms, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, or the social platforms, that's what they reward. So if you want to get attention, and politicians are in the attention game, that's the behavior that it now dictates. So I think in our landscape today, no, but I do love, at a grassroots level, what Andrew Yang is trying to do with the Forward Party in the US, and he's coming at it from grassroots, saying, "Hey, the political polarization between our parties isn't going to change unless we can change the way people vote." And the systems that they use, from some kind of proportional representation that rewards candidates who are less polarizing. So I think, those ground shifts probably need to happen before you could do something like, regulate an entire industry and say you can't use advertising. But I think there are other ways, other smaller regulations that absolutely could be put in force that, maybe have to get, bipartisan support. Whether that's looking at, I think it's Title 230 that gives all of these platforms immunity from what people say on their platforms. It's like, okay, that's great. But if you have an algorithm that you're now optimizing what gets amplified, I think you should have there should be some recourse if YouTube or Facebook chooses to amplify misinformation or information that's harmful to society. If they're merely just a repository for it, that's different.
Who determines if it's misinformation? Like, for example, in COVID, at the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of, information from the medical profession that was pro and that was against some of the processes and testing and masks and whatever. I mean, who determines what's misinformation anymore now?
It's, I don't think there is an easy answer. I think when you look at something like COVID, the best science at the time said something, and as science evolves, the very nature and purpose of science is, if there are countering scientific results, then science adjusts its view. But at that point in time, for the good of everyone, the best that we could recommend is this at this stage. Wearing masks, for example, went from don't wear them because they were afraid, I guess, they would sell out and the medical establishment wouldn't have them, to wearing them. And then it became, again, a polarized issue. It's like, well, I think the best science even today says it probably helps. If you got flu or a cold, wearing a mask yourself probably helps counter the spread to other people. I think it's same for COVID. Is it the cure? Is it the be-all on 100%? No.
Right. No.
But is it better for you? Yes.
But it could be common sense.
And sense, right? And to me, it just falls in. Hey, just look at it and think critically, or use common sense and answer that question for yourself. And yet, you had people with very big platforms who are out there saying it's a sham, it's a this. Whenever anything goes into the conspiracy theory side of the house, that's where I start to question it. Whether it's misinformation or it's ugly cousin, which is disinformation. Misinformation would be, hey, this is what I believe. I may not be right, but at least, I'm not a malign actor necessarily in sharing what I believe. And then you've got people who are actively, in the world of disinformation where I know it's wrong and I'm going to share it. I think, that one becomes a little clearer because it's just, spreading information that just plainly isn't true. Again, not even the scientific truth, but take the case recently with Alex Jones. And, finally there were consequences for someone with a big following spreading clear disinformation and falsehoods, and 10 years in the making, there was a reckoning in the courts.
Right.
That's a hard, that if every time someone spreads information, we have to wait for the courts to weigh it, that's a hard, very high bar for anyone to get any recourse. But at least it sent a message that, hang on a minute, this guy, and this was all around the Sandy Hook, at the time, claimed it was a conspiracy theory, went on air, his followers, it was clearly, this is not good. This is not a good faith actor. I would at least like something that says, he shouldn't be amplified. And, ultimately he was deplatformed. But, it's a tough one. There is no, as I said, if there were easy answers, we'd have solutions. Twitter or Facebook, they've got tons of smart people. They would have solved these problems. They are thorny, hard problems. But if I do come back to, Facebook and Twitter try to deal with it after the fact. The whole system's engineered such that, we're going to reward this sensational. And then when things get out of hand, I'm going to use my terms of service to try and remove you or put a marker on that or fact check it or deplatform you or whatever it is. I think versus governance, we're going in, they kind of use governance rather instead of culture. I prefer culture over governance. Governance is what Facebook and Twitter try to do. Here's my terms of service. I'm going to judge you against this, give you some warnings, deplatform you, remove your tweet, whatever it may be. But they don't have the culture. The way their platforms, their businesses very much work, quite frankly, in my opinion at least, but they don't have a culture that says this is unacceptable. If we can come at it we need the culture, because then the culture will make those things unacceptable to the people that are participating. That is probably a much better way to deal with the problem than governance after the fact. And to that end, what I'm, hot off the press, I suppose, and still very much, this is more a thought process, an ideation. But my very simple thing is, well, what if, it's kind of this idea of just thinking big. I don't know if it's technically feasible or how to do it yet, but what if there was the equivalent of a Hippocratic Oath that governed our public and online discourse? If you're in the medical profession, you kind of sign up for the modern day Hippocratic Oath, which often gets paraphrased as a kind of do no harm. That captures a whole lot of things that, doctors agree in their profession. And if they find, that they've, been subject to malpractice claims, they go up in front of a medical board and they can potentially get struck off by their peers. So I look at it and kind of say, hey, that doesn't mean there aren't bad actors in the medical profession, but yet it's somewhat self-policing. I kind of, the analogy I have is, God, what if we could have, some kind of equivalent oath that those who want to be, those that have a following, those that are influencers, celebrities, politicians, you could incentivize enough of them to take an oath that is just basic, universal human virtues or truths, like, and again, I'm making this up, should we say, but I will strive to do no harm with my words and actions online. I respect the privacy and dignity of others and not engage in, any form of cyberbullying, harassment, or hate speech. I use my words and actions to promote understanding, empathy, compassion, and not spread misinformation or propaganda. You could imagine things that, it doesn't matter whether you're a conservative or a liberal. We may not agree on what's, is this truth or is that, but you could, I'd hope anyone could read those things and kind of say, yeah, I'd sign up for that.
Yeah.
And then, again, you build a culture around I'm willing to be held accountable in my online and my public discourse against this oath.
Yeah, we might not agree philosophically on our opinions, but we can agree on how we're going to discuss them or how we'll conduct ourselves in a way that is positive to the conversation or positive to the movement. And it's funny, you were talking about culture earlier, and it's, could this be as simple? I worked for an organization once, and nobody got fired. They got voted off as a group. It was a collective, you know what? This guy gets to stay this year. This guy gets to
you're
move.
Off the island.
And you're on your own. And so, it's an interesting concept to think that we could self-govern our conduct, not necessarily our opinions. And there's some dancing here in between these. Indeed. Because, you get a bunch of people with an opinion, they're going to want to get somebody out of there. But as it scales in groups, I mean, there's no question. There's a lot of roadblocks to governance. There's a lot of roadblocks to regulations. There's a lot of roadblocks, but when everybody enters a platform and agrees to conduct themselves in a certain way, and if they don't, then they could be asked to leave.
Exactly. And I think, you don't want to create the next tech behemoth that just becomes, the next generation's problem, or the Facebook problem 10 years from now type of thing. And I think it's exactly that. It's looking at this as a movement. And that was one of the ideas we came up with out of last year's brainstorming, was you need a movement. You need to create a movement that kind of, boycott. As I've always believed, as consumers, we get to vote with our feet. As employees, I get to vote with my feet. If I don't like what my employer's doing, or I don't like, my job, I get to vote with my feet. That's the consumer, the beauty of the consumer and capitalist societies and democracies we live in. And I think if I don't like what Fox News is doing, I'm not going to give them my attention. If I don't like what Facebook is doing, I removed myself from Facebook probably 3 years ago now for this very reason, which is I didn't like what they were doing. In terms of my privacy and the way they were stoking rage, and I think being part of the breakdown of civil discourse. So I removed myself from Facebook and basically no longer on Facebook. Don't check it. I'd loved Facebook, before 2012, where I could see what my friends were doing and follow them and keep in touch with people. Awesome. I'd love to be on that platform again, but the platform that it is, I'm not going to give them my attention. Well, they can't. I'm not going to generate any ad revenue for them. So in a small, tiny little way, I voted with my feet, and I'm not going to support businesses with my attention who I feel are not doing the good for humanity. So I think, that was one of the, ideas out of this movement was, well, what if you could build a movement and then set it up as a, and again, I use some of the, not very in vogue at the moment, but from crypto land, the decentralized autonomous organization. I like the intent of it, which is you want the community to police itself. We all agree, we all take this oath, and as a set of oath takers, sounds like a cult now, I know, but as a set of people that have signed up and promised to uphold this oath, we should get to vote whether someone else is upholding that oath. And that's, as long as you've got diversity in there, as you said, just because we all believe X, we want Y out of here because they believe Y. No, you want lots of X's, lots of Y's, lots of Z's, and you want them all to be able to come together and say, hey, this person's up for review because they've been flagged, or someone's flagged them and said, we don't feel they're upholding the oath. Okay, well, as you said, did they get voted off the island or not, out of the collective? And if they do, they lose their standing. And then there has to be some teeth to that, which is, well, hopefully, and again, this is a big hope, that if you had this and people were, self-signing up and taking the pledge, there would be, there was some level of accountability for upholding that pledge. Then maybe the platforms themselves would say, well, if someone's taken the pledge and they're And they've got the universal check mark that Twitter or Facebook are now bringing out. Well, I'm going to give them preferential access to features, or I'm going to give them preferential treatment. Their voice is going to have more weight in my algorithms because they have been judged a good faith actor by the collective, not just on my platform, but across all platforms, whether that's traditional media, YouTube videos, so you could imagine a world that, and again, I hate to think that it descends into, the thought police in 1984 and so on and so forth, but that's why I think it's important that it's for the good of humanity, and therefore it has to be in the hands of the people. So it's kind of by the people, for the people, type of idea. And again, how you engineer that, TBD, watch this space.
It's a massive problem, bud. I'm glad you're working on it and not me. It's from a technologist standpoint, what was hitting me was, how do you even begin to unravel even what we've talked about? And I mean, even we just took the example of, a collective, kind of voting process, self-governing. How would you, as a technologist, start to engineer something like that, and what would be required, and who else would you have to bring in? And I mean, it seems to me that it'd be pretty difficult.
So I think if you go back to the kind of old venture startup maxim, I'm trying to think who it came from. But it's, think big, start small, scale fast. So, if you're going to do kind of the tech entrepreneur world that I've come from, if you're not thinking big, then, you've got to ask, am I solving a big enough problem that's going to, be ultimately a sustainable business? Am I, it may, from where I am in life, is it going to make enough, is it going to have a bigger impact? Am I going to do enough good or good for society as a whole? So think big. So I think last year was all about thinking big. This idea that, some of the things we just riffed on all came from that kind of big thinking. So now it's like, okay, start small. So where the hell do you start? Because otherwise, if you try and boil the ocean, there's no way. So you've got to break it down. You've got to chunk it down, and that's part of what we're doing now with a little kitchen cabinet that that's working on. Okay, how do we break this down into something where we can take a cup of water and boil that, and then take another cup and boil that, and so forth. So, as a technologist, I want to go build tech and platforms and AI, and use some of the amazing advances we've seen with the likes of OpenAI and ChatGPT. So my mind goes there. But my answer is, starting small is easy. You set up a website, you create the oath, and then the hard part is you have to find some people with platforms that have reach, that believe what we're talking about, that see the common sense of it, that see it's even feasible to do, and get them to be your founding community members who are going to sign up and take the pledge and publicize the fact they take the pledge and be willing to be held accountable for taking the pledge. So it's a website where someone can sign up, and then it can show you that this person's taken the pledge, and you then have them, with their following, whether that's a podcast, it's a politician, it's a celebrity, it's an influencer on TikTok, all walks of life, you want to, ideally get people from all of those spheres. And I think if the this Hippocratic Oath, if you like, if it's compelling enough that you just kind of look at it and say, well, why wouldn't I? Then the only problem is just getting the bullhorn and just saying, hey, look, this is nothing other at this stage than just, these people have agreed to uphold this set of standards in their public discourse. Yeah, so I think, phase one is you create a movement. You've got to build a movement. So I think that's the first phase, that if no one cares, then it stops there and then. But as with, movements take time to develop and need critical mass. But once you've developed the movement, I think then you can apply technology to say, okay, well, can we use technology to help with making sure that there is some accountability for the pledges that people have made, and that they are truly upholding in their public discourse. They are upholding their oath in the public discourse. So I think technology can come to play at that stage. And then I think you can develop, maybe that becomes more of a platform at that point. And then you can develop more of a system around it, which is, okay, well, now how do I make it so that others can take advantage or leverage the fact that we have people who are being held accountable across their media platforms that maybe they're on. And then maybe these platforms can use, your reputation as being part of this group for their own good. And they can use it to improve the quality of discourse on their own platform, because now they can amplify people who have a common cultural approach to, online discourse. So I think, that would be, and again, that's just some quick riffing and thinking that, I've been kind of having at the last few weeks. But I think it's a step function. Where you could get to is maybe this whole distributed, decentralized community organization that is self-policing. But you don't start there. As with any entrepreneurial endeavor, you want to be, a big successful company 10 years from now, but you don't start out being a big successful company. So you've got to work out where to start small. And then, once you've found, resonance within the user base, market, community, or whatever you're going after, in this case, obviously trying to build those early founding community members, then you figure out how you scale. And I think technology is the way you scale.
Who else is doing this stuff? I mean, there's lots of people that are, there's every single dinner party I go to, everybody's talking about this. Everybody's talking about the concern that social media is turning this world upside down, and people have this unlimited platform, and It's like, so there has to be other people out trying to solve this problem. What have you seen?
There definitely are. And again, if you go, zoom out a little bit, as I was talking about earlier, what we were looking at last year, there's people pursuing regulation, politicians and lobby groups, researchers that are doing research on the consequences of, our attention-driven economy, and the impact on society. So absolutely, there's people trying to do education with documentaries like The Social Dilemma. So I think there are people working in various areas. There's people working on proof of personhood, so we can kind of be sure that, I may not know that it's Dwayne, but I know you're a real person and not a bot or, some foreign actor pretending to be a real person type of thing. This particular lens, when I look at, is there anyone trying to tackle, there's people trying to build new communities. There's people trying to build new platforms, a better Facebook, a better Twitter, or a different type of community platform. That that's whether it's in the kind of Web3 decentralized internet world or just normal internet world, there's definitely people pursuing that. What I haven't seen as we were doing all of our research is someone that's coming at it from what I've just talked about, with this idea of, what if you could just have a universal kind of Hippocratic Oath that would be self-policing of public and online discourse, at least for those people that matter, should we say, those with significant reach, those that have a big voice. Have not seen anything in that necessarily. I think from the research we've done, we've seen Facebook trying to use technology, AI, and huge groups of content moderators to try and do the governance part. We've seen Twitter try to do the governance part and then disband their whole governance infrastructure when it got acquired, and all of the people that did that aren't doing that anymore, type of thing. We've seen people refine their terms of service or try and dance between, is this misinformation? Is this not is it subject to our terms of service? Is it not? So we've seen the reactionary. What I haven't seen is anyone trying to do try and deal with it up front as a culture problem. Seen people trying to build awareness, people and researchers writing books around our biases and how we're so easily led as human beings. So lots of that, but still no one outside of the individual platforms trying to police themselves. And I think, I don't know, I think to paraphrase what I said earlier, to solve today's problems needs a different level of thinking, a different type of thinking. And so the beauty of being an entrepreneur and being outside the frame of being in Facebook or Google or whatever it is, we get to see it from a different perspective. So I think there's, don't get me wrong, I think there are smart, motivated people trying to tackle elements of this problem. And I think it's going to take all vectors to align for us to really tackle this problem. Even what I'm talking about is just one part of the solution. I don't think it's the solution. I don't think there is the solution. I think it's part of an adjustment along with regulation, along with education, along with maybe better platforms, maybe better business models, or at least incentives to use different business models beyond an attention-driven kind of ad-driven business model. I think what I'd love to see, and we toyed with this idea, was it's almost like you need to put on a conference and invite all of these people who are working in these different areas just to come together and, knock heads and like multidisciplinary and say, all the researchers that are, who are charting out the impact on society that, we've seen over the last 10 years, get them all in a room and just say, hey, we need all of us to be focused in in all of these areas for us to really tackle this problem. And I think, that's what you've seen, the good part about COVID was, there was nothing good about COVID necessarily, but there was a lot of polarization, there was a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and yet there's a certain section of society that doesn't believe in vaccines, don't get me wrong, and that's fair enough if that's your belief. But we developed a vaccine on a global scale in a time frame that was absolutely unheard of by open research, smart minds working together to come up and solve a problem that in normal regulatory and efficacy lands would have taken a decade. And they did it in 18 months. So I look at that, when you can bring smart people together, human beings can do amazing things. That's the optimist part of me, I suppose, is this is not an insurmountable problem, as long as we need enough people to be aware that it's a problem so that they're motivated to work on the solution. It's kind of like it's the old the idea of shifting the consciousness of 1 billion people I talked about earlier. We want to change the conversation. The changing conversation leads to a new narrative that leads to a new imperative that drives new action. And so part of this is, that you just need a small subset of people to be having a different conversation and creating a new narrative that creates a new imperative for them that drives action. And, I'm just one of many people that I think see this as a problem and are, have an imperative to do something about it and are being driven to take action. And that small group of people can change the world.
Yeah, look, there's a silver lining to every cloud, and I'm a firm believer that every problem that exists to lead us to a solution or a path to a solution, whether there's many steps to it. And, when you talk about, the changing consciousness, which is probably needed. I mean, it's obvious it's needed. But, you know, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And in order to do such a thing like change, you know, even to think about the change of consciousness of 8 billion people on the planet and how we look at things, you have to have a major problem. You have to have you know, an epidemic, a pandemic, whatever it is. And this is, you know, maybe the pandemic here with COVID was just a lead in to, you know, what the real pandemic may be, which is, you know, this elevated discourse that's happening, not just in North America, it's happening around the world. I mean, it's everywhere. And, you know, that is the, you know, the cause that will lead to the effect of changing consciousness. It's an unbelievable conversation. And
not the one I was expecting to be having today. This is, you know, you can't publish this podcast for probably a year because it's all completely confidential. And I've
it's going
got
live,
to launch
baby,
something first.
Hey, maybe with all my followers, I mean, this will probably lead you something that will be some type of gift.
From the Dwayne Kerrigan podcast to Joe Rogan in one hop.
Boom. Just because I had you as a guest. Right?
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, it's we could take this anywhere. I mean, this conversation's been unbelievable, and obviously you've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it's fascinating to see your thought processes through it. You know, I'd love to carry on the conversation with, you spoke about AI and being able to utilize some of, you know, that technology, which would be, you know, fascinating for you as a technologist. And you talked about GPT, like that's, I mean, mind blowing. We use it fairly regularly, and it's just mind blowing what it does. And, you know, maybe this is a lead into another invitation to be, you know, come onto the podcast, because those are conversations that'll probably take us another hour and 10 or 15 minutes that we've already been on this call. And so love to have you back for that if you're open to it. But unbelievable conversation, man. Thank you for the time and the thought that you've put into this.
My pleasure. And I'll be happy to come back anytime and riff on all sorts of things.
How's next week?
Next week? Tomorrow.
That was great, man. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's really good.